Germany did not lose a vote. Germany did not lose a summit. Germany did not lose a diplomatic argument in the way that powerful nations occasionally lose arguments and then regroup and reassert themselves through the next available institutional mechanism. What Germany lost in the last 72 hours is something that cannot be recovered through a better strategy or a more carefully worded communique or the kind of quiet back-channel repair work that European institutions have always used to smooth over conflicts before they become visible to the outside world. Germany lost the architecture, the entire construction of continental dominance that Berlin spent. Italy did not send a strongly worded diplomatic note through the appropriate channels and then wait for Brussels to mediate a face-saving compromise. Italy filed. And what it filed, where it filed it, and what was buried inside those 340 pages has triggered a crisis that is simultaneously burning inside a European court, inside Washington situation rooms, inside Beijing foreign ministry briefings, and across every major bond trading floor on the planet. Stay with us because what just happened will be studied for decades, and most of what you have been told about it so far has missed the part that actually matters. To understand the full seismic weight of what Italy just executed, you have to start with what Germany believed going into this confrontation. Because the detail that makes this story extraordinary is not that Germany lost. It is that Germany lost while being completely confident it had already won. Berlin's strategists inside the finance ministry, inside the quiet institutional back channels of the European Commission, inside the technocratic machinery that has steered Eurozone fiscal policy for the better part of 2 decades, were not nervous in the weeks leading up to this moment. They were comfortable. They had spent months constructing what they believed was a fiscal consolidation framework so technically sophisticated, so legally camouflaged inside the standard language of European fiscal responsibility and multilateral solidarity, and so precisely engineered to foreclose Italy's available responses that Rome's eventual submission was not a possibility they were working toward. It was an outcome they had already priced in. They had stress-tested every scenario. They had mapped every path Italy could plausibly take and concluded that each one led to the same destination, a moment where Rome would absorb the framework's conditions because the alternative of that, while Berlin was constructing its trap with 11 weeks of quiet institutional preparation, Rome was constructing a counter with 3 years of legal groundwork. The moment everything shifted happened not in a summit chamber and not in a Brussels press briefing. It happened in a closed session of the Italian Council of Ministers at 11:47 in the evening when Meloni placed a bound document on the table and told her cabinet that what they were about to read would determine whether Italy remained a sovereign member state of the European Union or became the first nation in the institution's 70-year history to be reduced to the functional status of a financial protectorate administered by another member state. The room went silent. When the ministers finished reading, the silence did not break into debate. It broke into fury. The document on the table was not new intelligence, and it was not a freshly obtained communication. It was a legal dossier assembled in total secrecy over 11 weeks by Italian government lawyers drawing on 4 separate source categories: public European Commission procurement records, cross-reference data from the European Court of Auditors' annual reports, a series of internal policy correspondence obtained through a formal transparency request that Brussels had attempted and failed to legally block, and a technical annex prepared by 3 of Italy's most senior constitutional law professors whose conclusion was so explosive that when the lead attorney first presented it to Meloni's chief of staff, he was asked to leave the room while the implications were processed in private. The conclusion was this: the fiscal consolidation framework Germany had been circulating through Brussels back channels was not merely economically aggressive toward Italy. It was not simply politically hostile in the way that powerful member states are periodically hostile toward weaker ones inside institutional structures they have shaped to serve their interests. It was under the founding treaties of the European Union itself categorically and unambiguously illegal, not technically questionable, not positioned in the kind of legal gray territory that Brussels lawyers can argue about in working groups for 3 years while a policy gets implemented regardless. Illegal. The document violated Article 4 of the Treaty on European Union, which explicitly protects the national identity and constitutional structures of member states. It violated Protocol 12 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, governing the specific procedures and limits of fiscal oversight between member states. And it violated, in the assessment of Italy's constitutional experts, no fewer than 7 separate provisions of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights relating to democratic participation, institutional balance, and the separation of competences between national governments and supranational bodies. Germany had not drafted an aggressive fiscal framework. Germany had drafted an illegal one and had spent months attempting to move it through the system before anyone with the legal expertise and the institutional standing to challenge it formally had the opportunity to notice. Italy had noticed. Italy had documented every violation with chapter and article and subsection precision. And then Italy had done something that no member state had done in 7 decades of European integration. It had filed a formal legal challenge directly with the European Court of Justice, bypassing every layer of Commission mediation, every back-channel dispute resolution mechanism, and every informal process that Brussels maintains specifically to bury conflicts between member states before they reach the public record. The filing landed on the court docket at 6:14 in the morning. By 6:17, it had been automatically entered into the publicly accessible case registry. By 6:45, the first financial terminals in Frankfurt were flagging it. By 7:20, it was on the Reuters wire. By 8 o'clock, every major European bond desk was operating on emergency footing, and the euro had dropped against the dollar in less than 2 hours of trading. Germany had spent 11 weeks building its framework in total secrecy. Italy had detonated it in public in under 45 minutes, but the legal filing was not the weapon. The financial markets understood this within the first frantic hours of trading, even as the political analysts and Brussels correspondents were still processing the surface-level drama of a member state taking another member state to the European Court of Justice. The filing was the opening move, because buried inside those 340 pages was a section that German legal teams, when they finally obtained access to the full document 3 hours after it entered the public registry, read with the kind of controlled horror that career diplomats spend entire careers training themselves not to display. Italy was not simply challenging the fiscal consolidation framework. Italy was challenging the legal foundation of the entire oversight architecture Germany had constructed inside the Eurozone across the previous 15 years. Every framework, every quietly inserted mechanism, every provision that had incrementally transferred fiscal authority away from elected national governments and toward Frankfurt aligned technocratic bodies that operated with the language of neutral expertise, but served the structural interests of the Eurozone's dominant creditor economy. All of it challenged simultaneously in a single filing before the highest court in Europe, supported by 70 pages of legal analysis that Italy's lawyers had clearly not assembled in 11 weeks. They had been preparing it for years. Germany had walked into what it believed was a controlled demolition of Italian fiscal sovereignty. It had just discovered it was standing at the center of a controlled demolition of its own. The moment the filing hit the public registry, something happened inside the Brussels institutional machinery that had not occurred in living memory. It froze. Not in the metaphorical sense in which bureaucracies slow when confronted with uncomfortable decisions. It froze in the literal operational sense. The Commission's legal directorate, the body whose function is precisely to manage interinstitutional crises of this character, could not issue a response because no procedure existed for this situation. Every conflict resolution mechanism inside the European Union's institutional architecture rests on a foundational assumption that has never been seriously tested until this morning. The assumption that member states do not actually go to the court. They threaten to go to the court. They deploy the possibility of litigation as negotiating leverage. They allow Commission mediators to step in, find language that permits. What made the Commission's paralysis even more damaging was the timing. Because the morning Italy's filing entered the public record was not an ordinary Tuesday in the Brussels calendar. It was 48 hours before a scheduled Eurogroup meeting that Germany had spent 3 weeks choreographing with extraordinary precision. The agenda had been constructed to manufacture the appearance of broad multilateral consensus around the fiscal consolidation framework before it was formally presented for adoption as official EU policy. The speaking order had been arranged. The draft communique had been pre-negotiated with 6 member states whose finance ministers had privately committed to supporting the German position in exchange for concessions on separate budget lines entirely unrelated to Italy. Germany had assembled its coalition. Germany had written the script. Germany had arranged every element of a performance designed to move the framework from a circulating document to an official policy instrument with the legitimacy of apparent collective endorsement. Italy had just made the performance impossible to stage, because the moment the legal challenge became public, every finance minister who had privately committed to supporting Germany's position faced an identical and politically catastrophic problem. They had agreed to back a framework that a founding member state had now formally declared illegal before the highest court in Europe. Attaching their names and their governments to that position in an official Eurogroup session with cameras and transcripts and a permanent public record meant accepting the possibility that within months they would be on the record supporting a policy ruled a fundamental violation of EU treaty law. The carefully assembled German coalition did not convene an emergency meeting to discuss this problem. It did not send a collective message to Berlin explaining the shift. It simply evaporated through the quiet, untraceable channels that European diplomacy has always run on. Finance ministers who had been confirmed supporters 48 hours earlier became unavailable, non-committal, suddenly consumed by procedural questions about whether the Eurogroup meeting should be postponed given the extraordinary legal circumstances now surrounding its primary agenda item. Germany watched its coalition dissolve in real time and possessed no instrument capable of stopping the dissolution. Because the tool it had always used to hold these coalitions together, the implicit understanding that Berlin's support could be withdrawn from any government that crossed it, had been neutralized by the same filing that had neutralized everything else. The Eurogroup meeting was postponed. The announcement arrived through a 4-line statement from the rotating presidency citing the need for additional legal clarity on agenda items currently subject to judicial proceedings. It was the most antiseptic diplomatic formulation available for communicating that Germany had lost the room entirely. But the postponement, humiliating as it was not the development that sent the German finance ministry into genuine crisis mode that afternoon. That development came from Rome, because while Germany was managing the collapse of its Eurogroup strategy and the Commission sat paralyzed and bond markets repriced European sovereign debt in real time, Meloni's government, not to the multilateral diplomatic contacts that operate within EU institutional frameworks and are therefore subject to the same pressures Germany has always been capable of applying. It had been calling Washington, and it had been calling Beijing. The content of those calls began leaking through financial intelligence channels by mid-afternoon, and what they revealed transformed the picture entirely. Italy was not conducting a defensive legal action inside European institutions. Italy was internationalizing the conflict with a strategic ambition that went far beyond anything the court filing alone could have achieved. The message carried to Washington was constructed with precise attention to what would land with maximum impact inside an American administration that had harbored its own long-running frustrations with German dominance of European economic governance. Italy communicated directly to senior Treasury and National Security Council officials that the fiscal consolidation framework represented a unilateral German attempt to seize operational control of strategic European assets, including defense contractors operating under active NATO contracts, energy infrastructure with direct implications for transatlantic supply security, and communications networks whose ownership structure carried relevance to Allied intelligence cooperation. Italy was not requesting American intervention. It was requesting American attention. And Washington, which had spent years watching German-aligned technocratic bodies extend their reach across Eurozone economic governance in ways that occasionally conflicted with American strategic preferences, paid attention with an attentiveness that sent immediate shockwaves back through Berlin's diplomatic cables. The calls to Beijing were different in register, but identical in strategic logic. China had spent years attempting to deepen its infrastructure and energy investment relationships across southern Europe and had been blocked at every turn by German-aligned opposition inside EU foreign investment screening mechanisms. Italy's message to